Faith Sullivan entered an abandoned library looking for shelter from a winter storm. She had no idea she was about to uncover a century-old secret that powerful people had spent generations trying to hide. At just 21 years old, Faith had already lost everything. Orphaned as a child and left with nothing but a backpack and a bus ticket, she arrived in Blackridge with nowhere to go and no one waiting for her. What she discovered inside that abandoned library would expose a shocking betrayal, rewrite the history of an entire town, and reveal a truth someone was still desperate to keep buried. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Most people drove past the old Blackridge Library without ever slowing down. The building sat alone at the edge of town, hidden behind towering pines and years of neglect. Its stained glass windows were shattered. Vines crawled across its stone walls like veins. The iron gates hung crooked on rusted hinges, swaying softly whenever the wind swept down from the mountains. To the people of Blackridge, it was just another forgotten ruin. But to Faith Sullivan, it would become the place that changed everything. At 21 years old, Faith had already spent most of her life feeling invisible. She never knew her parents. The only thing she had ever been told was that they died when she was too young to remember. After that, she was passed from one foster home to another, carrying her belongings in garbage bags and learning not to get attached to people, places, or promises. Every time she started to feel at home somewhere, it ended. A new family, a new school, a new goodbye. By the time she aged out of the foster care system, Faith had learned a painful lesson: the world kept moving, whether you belonged in it or not. Still, she tried. She worked long hours at a small community center in Vermont, helping children who reminded her of herself. For the first time, she felt like she was building something meaningful. Then the funding disappeared. The center closed, and within weeks, Faith lost her job, her apartment, and the fragile future she had worked so hard to create. She packed what little she owned into a worn backpack and boarded a bus heading north, chasing the faint hope of finding work in a small mountain town called Blackridge. But fate had other plans. A brutal winter storm rolled in as the bus climbed through the mountains. Ice coated the roads. Visibility vanished beneath curtains of snow. When the driver announced they could go no farther, Faith stepped into the freezing darkness with nowhere to go. No family, no friends, no home, only the storm. For hours, she walked through the unfamiliar town, her coat soaked with melting snow, her fingers numb from the cold. Then she saw it. A massive stone building standing alone beyond the trees. The old Blackridge Library. Its front doors were slightly open, groaning against the wind. Faith hesitated. Then she stepped inside. The scent of dust and old paper wrapped around her immediately. Rows of forgotten books stretched into darkness. Broken chandeliers hung motionless overhead. The silence felt strange, almost alive. For the first time in weeks, she was warm. For the first time in months, she felt safe. She had entered the abandoned library looking for nothing more than shelter from the storm. She had no idea that hidden somewhere within those crumbling walls was a secret buried for over a century. A secret that powerful people had killed to protect. And a story that was about to change her life forever. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. Wind rattled the library's broken windows, sending low whistles through the dark corridors. Snow pressed against the glass like ghostly hands searching for a way inside. Faith Sullivan sat on the floor between two towering bookshelves, wrapped in an old blanket she had found in a storage closet. A flashlight rested beside her, casting a weak circle of light across the faded carpet. She should have been sleeping. She was exhausted. But something about the library kept her awake. It wasn't fear. At least, not entirely. It was curiosity. The kind that tugged at you quietly. The kind that whispered, "Keep looking." Faith had spent most of her life learning how to survive. She rarely had the luxury of wondering about mysteries. Yet, as she sat surrounded by thousands of forgotten books, she couldn't shake the feeling that this place was hiding something. Something important. She rose to her feet and began wandering through the building. The library was much larger than she had first realized. Hall after hall stretched into darkness. Dust-covered reading rooms stood frozen in time. Ancient wooden desks remained exactly where someone had left them decades ago. Children's books sat untouched on shelves, their bright covers faded by age. It felt less like an abandoned building, and more like a memory someone had forgotten to erase. Faith moved slowly, running her fingers along the spines of books. History, poetry, science, travel journals, entire lives preserved in paper. The deeper she wandered, the stranger the atmosphere became. The silence felt heavier, almost watchful. Eventually, she reached the oldest section of the library, a narrow wing tucked away behind a set of rusted iron doors. A brass plaque hung crookedly on the wall. Archives. The word was barely readable beneath layers of dust. Faith pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly. A long corridor stretched ahead. Shelves lined both sides from floor to ceiling. Boxes of documents sat untouched for decades. The air smelled older here, like paper that had spent generations waiting for someone to read it. Faith shined her flashlight around the room. That was when she noticed something strange. At the far end of the corridor stood a bookshelf unlike the others. Every shelf in the archive was dark oak. This one was painted black, and unlike the others, it appeared completely empty. Her footsteps echoed softly as she approached. The shelf looked ordinary at first glance, but something felt wrong. The dust covering the floor stopped abruptly in front of it, as if someone had stood there recently. Faith frowned. That made no sense. Nobody came here. At least, nobody was supposed to. She reached out and placed her hand against the wood. Cold. Solid. Then her fingers brushed something unusual. A small metal latch hidden along the side. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she pressed it. A sharp click echoed through the archive. The entire bookshelf shifted. Faith jumped backward. For a moment, she simply stared. Then the shelf slowly swung inward like a door, revealing a hidden room behind it. Her heart pounded. Every sensible part of her mind told her to walk away. Instead, she stepped inside. The room was small. No windows, no furniture except a single wooden desk and a narrow bookshelf built into the wall. Dust floated through the beam of her flashlight. Everything looked untouched. Everything except the object resting on the desk. A book. No, not a book. Something older. Much older. Faith approached carefully. The volume was bound in dark leather cracked by time. Its brass corners had turned green with age. No title appeared on the cover. Just a small symbol pressed into the leather. A tree with deep roots. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she opened the cover. The pages inside were filled with handwritten entries. Beautiful cursive script stretched across yellowed paper. The first page carried a name. Clara Whitmore. Below it was a date. March 12, 1924. Faith swallowed. She had never heard the name before, but something about it immediately felt important. She began reading. The first entry seemed ordinary enough. Observations about library visitors, thoughts about books, small details of daily life in Blackridge. But as the pages continued, the tone changed. Gradually, then dramatically, the cheerful young librarian disappeared. In her place emerged a woman growing increasingly frightened. One passage caught Faith's attention. There are records hidden beneath the town hall that do not match the public archives. Entire properties have vanished from official maps. Families who once owned them are nowhere to be found. Faith sat down slowly. The storm outside faded from her awareness. She kept reading. Another entry. I was warned today not to ask questions. Mr. Holloway said some histories are best forgotten. The way he looked at me made my blood run cold. The handwriting became shakier as the journal progressed. Fear seeped through every sentence. Faith turned page after page. Hours passed unnoticed. The deeper she went, the more shocking the story became. Clara had uncovered evidence that Blackridge's founding families had stolen thousands of acres from immigrant settlers nearly a century earlier. Land deeds had been forged, records altered, witnesses bribed, entire bloodlines erased from local history. And the people responsible weren't strangers. They were the very individuals celebrated as the town's founders. Their portraits likely still hung in government buildings. Their names probably filled history books. Faith felt anger rising inside her. The entries continued. Then she reached a page that made her stop breathing. The ink appeared smudged, as if written in haste. If anything happens to me, the truth must survive. Below the sentence was a list of names. Dozens of them. Families, victims, witnesses. And beneath those names, one final line. A line written so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. The evidence is hidden where the library remembers. Faith stared at the words. Again and again. What did that mean? Where the library remembers. A code. A clue. A warning. Thunder exploded outside. The entire building trembled. Faith nearly dropped the journal. For the first time that night, she became aware of how alone she was. Or at least how alone she thought she was. Because at that exact moment, she heard footsteps. Above her, slow, deliberate, crossing the second floor of a building that should have been completely empty. Faith froze. The sound stopped. Silence returned. Then came a single creak, closer this time. And suddenly, for reasons she couldn't explain, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone else knew about Clara Whitmore's journal, and whoever it was, did not want the truth to be found. Faith Sullivan didn't move. She couldn't. The journal remained open in her hands, as she listened to the silence that followed the footsteps above. Every instinct told her to stay perfectly still. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the storm was shifting old floorboards. Maybe... A loud thud echoed from somewhere on the second floor. Faith jumped. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't an old building settling. That was something falling. Or someone moving. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, she switched off her flashlight. Darkness swallowed the hidden room. For several seconds, she sat frozen, barely breathing. Then she heard it again. Footsteps, measured, unhurried, crossing the floor directly above the archive. Whoever was there wasn't sneaking. They weren't afraid. They were walking like they belonged there. Faith's mouth went dry. The storm had trapped her in the library. And now she wasn't alone. The footsteps continued for nearly a minute. Then they stopped. Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Faith waited. 5 seconds. 10. 30. Nothing. Finally, she forced herself to move. Carefully closing Clara's journal, she slid it into her backpack. If someone was searching the library, she wasn't leaving it behind. Not now. Not after what she had read. She slipped out of the hidden room and quietly pushed the false bookshelf closed. The archive corridor stretched before her like a tunnel. Empty. Dark. Yet every nerve in her body screamed that someone was nearby. Faith started walking toward the main hall. Slowly. Quietly. Each step felt impossibly loud. When she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped. A faint light glowed somewhere upstairs. Her stomach tightened. She was certain that light hadn't been there before. Someone else had entered the building. Someone carrying a lantern or flashlight. The beam moved briefly across a second-floor railing, then vanished. Faith ducked behind a bookshelf. Her pulse raced. Who had come to an abandoned library in the middle of a snowstorm? And more importantly, why? She stayed hidden until the light disappeared completely. Only then did she make her way back toward the reading room. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the shadows, clutching her backpack and listening. Occasionally she thought she heard movement. A door closing, a distant creak, a faint scrape, but she never saw anyone. When dawn finally arrived, gray light filtered through the broken windows. The storm had ended. Faith stepped outside and immediately noticed something that made her blood run cold. Footprints. Fresh footprints, leading away from the library. Not one set. Two. One appeared old and heavy. The other looked newer, as though someone had arrived during the night. She followed them for several yards before they disappeared beneath fresh snow. A chill settled over her. She wasn't imagining things. Someone really had been there. Someone who knew the library wasn't empty. Someone who might know about Clara's journal. Over the next 3 days, Faith couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. She rented a tiny room above a diner in town using the last of her savings. During the day, she searched for work. At night, she returned to the journal. Page after page, entry after entry. The more she read, the darker Clara's story became. Several passages described meetings held in secret. Powerful men gathering behind closed doors. Documents disappearing from public records. Families forced off their land. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. They are watching. At first, Faith assumed Clara was paranoid. Then she reached the final entries. Everything changed. The handwriting had become rushed, uneven, terrified. One passage read, "I no longer trust anyone at the town hall. If this journal survives, it must remain hidden. The evidence is real. I have seen it with my own eyes." Another, "They followed me home tonight." Faith felt her chest tighten. The final pages were even worse. "If I disappear, do not believe what they say." And then, nothing. No final chapter. No explanation. The journal simply ended, as though Clara had vanished in the middle of her story. Faith closed the book. Her hands trembled. For nearly a century, everyone had believed Clara Whitmore had simply left Blackridge. But now she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Faith visited the town library records office, a small room tucked inside the municipal building. An elderly clerk greeted her politely. "What can I help you find?" Faith hesitated. Then she asked, "I'm looking for information about Clara Whitmore." The woman's smile disappeared, only for a moment. But Faith noticed. The clerk turned toward a filing cabinet. "That's an old name. So she was real." "Oh, yes." The woman pulled out a folder. She worked at the old library before it closed. Faith waited. What happened to her? The clerk seemed uncomfortable. No one really knows. Faith frowned. "She disappeared." The woman paused, then nodded. "That's the story. The story, not the truth." The difference suddenly felt important. Faith thanked her and left. But before she reached the door, the clerk spoke again. Quietly, almost nervously. "You should be careful asking questions about that library." Faith turned. "Why?" The woman looked toward the hallway before answering. "Some people in Blackridge don't like the past being disturbed." Then she quickly returned to her paperwork. Conversation over. That evening, Faith returned to the abandoned library. The winter sun was already disappearing behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered grounds. Everything looked peaceful, silent, but something felt different. The moment she entered, she knew. Someone had been there. Again. A chair had been moved. A desk drawer stood open. Books lay scattered across the floor near the archive wing. Faith's pulse quickened. She hurried toward the hidden room. The false bookshelf remained closed. At first glance, everything seemed untouched. Then she noticed it. A single piece of paper resting on the desk. She was certain it hadn't been there before. Slowly, she picked it up. Her breath caught. The message had been typed on an old typewriter. Only 6 words appeared on the page. "Stop digging. Some things stay buried." Faith stared at the warning. The room suddenly felt colder. Much colder. Someone knew she had found Clara's journal. Someone knew she was investigating. And someone wanted her to stop. But as fear settled into her chest, something else appeared beside it. Determination. Because for the first time in her life, Faith felt like she mattered. She wasn't just another forgotten foster kid drifting through the world. She had found something important. Something worth fighting for. She folded the warning and slipped it into her pocket. Then she looked back at Clara's journal and made a decision. She wasn't walking away, no matter who wanted her gone, no matter what they were hiding. She was going to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. And somewhere in the darkness of the library, unseen eyes were already watching her make that choice. Faith Sullivan couldn't stop thinking about the note. "Stop digging. Some things stay buried." The words followed her everywhere. She saw them while lying awake at night in her tiny rented room. She heard them while washing dishes at the diner where she had finally found part-time work. She felt them every time she opened Clara Whitmore's journal. Someone wanted her afraid. Someone wanted her to leave Blackridge. And for a while, it almost worked. Almost. Because fear was familiar to Faith. She had lived with it her entire life. Fear of being unwanted. Fear of being left behind. Fear of waking up one morning and discovering everything had changed again. As a child, she learned not to unpack her belongings completely. There was always another move coming. Another foster home. Another goodbye. She remembered sitting on strangers' couches while adults discussed her future as if she wasn't in the room. She remembered birthdays no one celebrated. Christmas mornings that felt ordinary. School events where every other child had someone cheering from the crowd. Every memory carried the same message. You don't belong. The older she became, the more she accepted it. Some people were born with roots. She wasn't. She was a temporary guest in other people's lives, or at least that was what she had believed. Until now. Until Clara. Until the library. Until the truth hidden beneath a century of silence. Because for the first time in her life, Faith had stumbled upon something that needed her. Not because she was special. Not because she was powerful, but because she was willing to listen, and that realization changed everything. One evening, Faith sat alone in the reading room of the abandoned library. The winter sun cast long golden shadows across the dusty floor. Clara's journal lay open in front of her. She had read most of it several times by now, yet one passage continued to draw her back. It appeared midway through the journal. Written months before Clara disappeared. The danger is not that people lie. The danger is that eventually everyone accepts the lie as truth. Faith stared at the sentence. Again and again. Something about it felt painfully relevant. Not just to Blackridge, to her own life. For years, she had accepted other people's versions of her story. The foster child. The girl with no family. The girl nobody chose. The girl expected to struggle. Expected to fail. Expected to disappear quietly into the background. Those labels had followed her for so long that she had stopped questioning them. They had become her truth, or what she believed was truth. But now she wondered, what if they were only another version of the story? What if she had been wrong about herself all along? The thought frightened her, and strangely, it also gave her hope. Over the following weeks, Faith threw herself into Clara's investigation. She began visiting county archives, property offices, historical societies, anywhere she might find records connected to the names listed in the journal. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Entire property transfers appeared to have vanished from official records. Old maps contradicted modern ones. Witness statements had disappeared. Documents had been altered. The evidence wasn't complete, but it was enough to confirm one thing. Clara hadn't imagined any of it. She had been telling the truth, and someone had spent generations covering it up. Faith expected to feel shocked. Instead, she felt angry, not only for Clara, not only for the families who had lost everything, but for every person who had been told their story didn't matter, because she understood that feeling. She had lived it. Perhaps that was why she couldn't walk away. The more she learned about Clara, the more she saw pieces of herself. A young woman with little power, a little influence, little protection, yet somehow brave enough to challenge people far more powerful than she was. Faith found herself wondering what Clara had felt during those final weeks. Had she been scared? Had she known what might happen? Had she ever considered giving up? Maybe, but she hadn't. And because she hadn't, the truth had survived, waiting all these years for someone else to find it. Someone like Faith. The shift inside her happened slowly, so slowly she barely noticed at first. One afternoon, while reviewing records at the county office, a local historian dismissed her questions. "You're wasting your time," he said. Those stories had been settled for decades. Normally, Faith would have apologized, backed down, changed the subject. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye. Then why are so many records missing? The man had no answer. For the first time, neither did she feel the need to make him comfortable. That surprised her. Later that night, she thought about the exchange and realized something important. She was no longer afraid of being ignored, because she had spent her entire life being ignored. What scared her now was something else: staying silent. The transformation became impossible to deny after she returned to the library one snowy evening. The building felt different than it had during her first night. Back then, it had seemed haunted, lonely, forgotten. Now it felt alive, not because of ghosts, but because of purpose. The shelves no longer looked abandoned. They looked patient. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt waiting, as though generations of untold stories had been holding their breath. Faith stood in the center of the reading room and looked around. For the first time since arriving in Blackridge, she wasn't thinking about where she would sleep next month, or whether she had enough money, or whether anyone cared about her future. She was thinking about something bigger: the people Clara had tried to protect, the families erased from history, the truth hidden beneath lies. And suddenly she understood something Clara had likely learned a century earlier. Purpose doesn't arrive when life becomes easy. It arrives when something becomes more important than your fear. A tear rolled down Faith's cheek. She quickly wiped it away, not because she was sad, but because she finally understood why she had found the library. Maybe she hadn't come to Blackridge by accident. Maybe losing everything had brought her exactly where she needed to be. For 21 years, she had searched for a place where she belonged, a place that felt like home, standing among the forgotten books and buried secrets of the old library. Faith realized she had finally found it. And if uncovering the truth meant making powerful enemies, then so be it. Because the frightened girl who stepped into the library during a snowstorm was slowly disappearing. In her place stood someone new, someone stronger, someone willing to fight, and somewhere beyond the library walls, the people protecting Blackridge's darkest secret were beginning to realize something dangerous. Faith Sullivan wasn't going away. She was just getting started. Faith Sullivan never expected anyone to believe her. For most of her life, people had barely noticed her. She was the foster kid who moved too often, the young woman who worked temporary jobs, the quiet girl standing at the edge of every room. So, when she finally decided to share what she had found inside Clara Whitmore's journal, she prepared herself for disappointment. She expected skepticism. She expected rejection. What she didn't expect was for the truth to start spreading. Slowly at first, then all at once. It began with a single email. One rainy evening, Faith sat alone at a corner table inside the diner after her shift ended. The library's old reading room had become her sanctuary, but she knew Clara's story needed more than secrecy. It needed witnesses. She attached scanned pages from the journal and sent them to a university historian whose work focused on forgotten communities and lost historical records. Then she waited. Days passed. Nothing. Faith told herself she wasn't surprised. Then, on the 5th morning, her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. Faith Sullivan. The voice belonged to Professor Daniel Mercer from New Hampshire. His tone was cautious, almost stunned. "Where exactly did you find these documents?" Faith sat upright. "In Blackridge." There was a long pause. Then he said something that made her heart stop. "If these pages are authentic, you've uncovered one of the most significant historical cover-ups I've seen in 20 years. For several seconds, Faith couldn't speak. After everything she had read, after every warning, after every threat, someone finally believed her. The professor wasn't the only one. Within weeks, more experts began reaching out. Archivists, genealogists, independent researchers, people who had spent years searching for missing pieces of history. Many of them recognized names from Clara's journal, names connected to families that seemed to disappear from public records almost overnight, names connected to land disputes no one had ever been able to fully explain. For the first time in nearly a century, Clara Whitmore's voice was reaching beyond the walls of the abandoned library, and people were listening. Faith spent hours answering emails, reviewing documents, comparing evidence. Every day brought new discoveries, new connections, new questions. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer one truth became. Clara had been right. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph, a family standing in front of a small farmhouse. A man, a woman, 3 children. Written on the back was a date from 1925, along with a short note. "My great-grandparents disappeared from Blackridge after refusing to sell their land. We always believed something was wrong. Your discovery helped us understand what happened. Thank you." Faith read the note 3 times. Then she sat quietly for a long while. For years, she had believed she was uncovering history. Now she realized she was helping real people, families, children, grandchildren, entire generations who had grown up with missing pieces of their own stories. The truth wasn't trapped in the past. It was still affecting lives today, and somehow she had become part of bringing those stories home. As word spread, something unexpected happened. People began returning to the library. At first, only a few curious visitors appeared. A retired teacher, a local journalist, a college student researching Blackridge history. Then more came, every week, every month. Some brought documents hidden in attics. Others carried old photographs, family letters, property records, newspaper clippings. The abandoned library slowly transformed into something else, a gathering place, a place where forgotten stories could finally be shared. Faith watched in amazement as volunteers started cleaning rooms that had been untouched for decades. Broken windows were repaired. Shelves were dusted. Boxes were organized. The building that once sheltered her from a snowstorm was beginning to wake up. And with it, so was the town. One afternoon, a visitor arrived from Arizona. His name was Gabriel Moreno. He was in his 60s and carried a weathered wooden box beneath his arm. When Faith welcomed him inside, he placed the box carefully on a reading table. "My grandmother told me stories about Blackridge," he said quietly. Nobody ever believed her. Inside the box were dozens of letters, old photographs, property records, and one small journal written in Spanish. Gabriel's family had been among those forced from their land nearly a century earlier. For generations, they had preserved every piece of evidence they could, waiting, hoping, praying that someday someone would uncover the truth. As Faith examined the documents, Gabriel smiled sadly. "Clara tried to protect us." His eyes drifted toward the old shelves. "Now you're doing the same." Faith felt emotion tighten her throat. Nobody had ever said something like that to her before. Growing up, she had often felt invisible, forgettable, easy to overlook. Yet here was a stranger telling her that her actions mattered, that she mattered. The realization struck deeper than she expected. The opportunities kept growing. A documentary filmmaker contacted her. A regional newspaper requested an interview. Historical preservation groups offered assistance. Even the State Archive Department expressed interest in examining Clara's journal. For the first time in her life, doors were opening instead of closing. But surprisingly, that wasn't what mattered most. The greatest opportunity wasn't fame, or recognition, or media attention. It was belonging. Every evening, as volunteers worked among the shelves and visitors shared stories in the reading room, Faith noticed something she had never experienced before. People were happy to see her. They asked for her opinion. They remembered her name. They saved her a seat at meetings, included her in conversations, trusted her. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of things most people took for granted. Yet to Faith, they felt extraordinary, because for the first time in 21 years, she wasn't passing through someone else's life. She was building one of her own. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, Faith stood alone in the center of the library. The building was quiet, warm, alive. Moonlight spilled through newly repaired windows. She looked toward the archive wing where she had first discovered Clara's journal. It felt like a lifetime ago. The frightened girl who entered the library during a snowstorm had been searching for shelter. Nothing more. Now she had become part of something much bigger. A movement, a mission, a promise. Faith walked slowly between the shelves and rested her hand on one of the old wooden tables. For the first time, she understood something that had eluded her for years. Home wasn't a place someone gave you. It was something you built. One connection at a time. One act of courage at a time. One truth at a time. And standing there among the voices history had almost erased, Faith realized she had finally found hers. The opportunity Clara had left behind was never about uncovering a secret. It was about restoring what had been lost, not just for Blackridge, but for Faith herself. And although she didn't know it yet, the greatest challenge of her journey was still ahead, because the people who had spent generations protecting the lie were finally beginning to fight back, and they were far more powerful than she imagined. Faith Sullivan thought the hardest part would be uncovering the truth. She was wrong. The hardest part was surviving what came after. For months, the story of Blackridge had spread beyond the town's borders. Historians were reviewing evidence, Journalists were investigating decades of missing records. Families, once erased from local history, were finally being heard. The abandoned library had become the center of something much larger than anyone imagined, and Faith had become its face. At first, that frightened her. Then it exhausted her. Eventually, it changed her, because every victory seemed to create a new enemy, and the more attention the truth received, the more resistance appeared. It started with small things. Emails disappeared. Scheduled interviews were suddenly canceled. Important documents went missing from public databases. One reporter who had been helping investigate the case stopped answering calls altogether. Then, one afternoon, Faith arrived at the library to find every window on the west side shattered. Glass covered the floor. Snow drifted inside. The volunteers stood silently among the wreckage. Someone had spray-painted 3 words across the front entrance. "Let it die." Faith stared at the message. Nobody spoke. The silence felt familiar. The same silence Clara Whitmore had written about a century earlier. The silence that appears when people are afraid. A younger version of Faith might have broken down, might have packed her bags and disappeared, but something inside her had changed. Instead, she picked up a broom and started cleaning. Within minutes, the volunteers joined her. By nightfall, the graffiti was gone. The broken glass had been swept away. The library remained standing, and so did they. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. A woman appeared at the library carrying a large cardboard box. She looked to be in her 70s. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached Faith. "I think these belong to you," she said. Faith frowned. "I don't understand." The woman opened the box. Inside were dozens of old photographs. Letters, property deeds, newspaper clippings, and one sealed envelope. The name written across the front made Faith's breath catch. Clara Whitmore. The woman smiled sadly. "My grandfather kept these hidden his entire life." Faith's heart pounded. "Why?" The woman hesitated, then gave an answer nobody expected. "Because he was engaged to Clara." The room went silent. For a moment, Faith wondered if she had heard correctly. The woman nodded slowly. "He spent 50 years trying to find out what happened to her." Faith carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. The first clear photograph anyone had ever found of Clara. She couldn't have been older than 25. Dark hair, gentle eyes, a shy smile. For the first time, Clara stopped feeling like a historical figure. She felt human, real. And beneath the photograph was a letter. A letter Clara had written only days before her disappearance. Faith unfolded the fragile paper. The room seemed to shrink around her as she read. "If anything happens to me, there is one final record they do not know exists." Everyone stared. Faith continued. "The evidence hidden inside the library is only part of the story. The rest remains beneath Blackridge itself." A stunned silence filled the room. Then came the final sentence. "If the truth is ever found, look beneath the founder's monument." Faith lowered the letter. Her pulse thundered. The founder's monument sat in the center of town. A massive stone memorial dedicated to the very families accused in Clara's journal. Thousands of people walked past it every year. Nobody had ever questioned what might lie beneath it. Until now. The discovery changed everything. Within days, historians began examining old maps again. Researchers compared construction records. Engineers reviewed blueprints from the early 20th century. The more they looked, the stranger things became. One map revealed an underground tunnel system long removed from official records. Another showed a storage vault beneath the town square. Every clue pointed toward the monument. Yet before anyone could investigate further, disaster struck. Late one night, Faith received a phone call. The library was on fire. She arrived to find flames climbing into the winter sky. Firefighters surrounded the building. Volunteers stood crying on the sidewalk. Faith's legs nearly gave out beneath her. For several horrifying minutes, she could only stare. The place that had saved her. The place that had given her purpose. The place where Clara's voice survived. Burning. A firefighter eventually approached. The fire started in the archive wing. Faith felt sick. The archive, the heart of everything. The investigation, the evidence. Years of history. Gone. Or so she thought. Then someone called her name. Professor Mercer emerged from the crowd, covered in soot, exhausted, holding a metal case. Faith stared. "What is that?" The professor smiled weakly. "The backup drives." She blinked. "What?" "The scans, every document, every photograph, every page of Clara's journal." He lifted the case. "We got them out." Relief hit her so hard she nearly cried. The evidence survived. The truth survived. Just as Clara had intended, the following morning, investigators confirmed what many already suspected. The fire had not been an accident. Someone had deliberately started it. Someone desperate enough to destroy an entire library. Someone terrified of what might be discovered next. And suddenly, the fight was no longer about old secrets. It was about a present-day conspiracy, a living one. For the first time, national media began paying attention. Television crews arrived. Major newspapers started asking questions. Pressure mounted, and the people hiding behind generations of silence were beginning to panic. Faith could feel it. Everyone could, because the closer they came to the truth, the more reckless their enemies became. That realization should have frightened her. Instead, it strengthened her. Months earlier, she had arrived in Blackridge with nothing. No family, no future, no place to belong. Now she stood at the center of a battle that could change the town forever. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from uncertainty. She was walking directly toward it, because she finally understood something Clara Whitmore had known all along. Truth doesn't survive because powerful people protect it. Truth survives because ordinary people refuse to let it die. And as Faith stood before the smoking remains of the library, watching dawn rise over Blackridge, she made herself a promise. No matter what waited beneath the founder's monument, no matter who tried to stop her, she would uncover it. Because the story wasn't over. In fact, the most shocking discovery of all was still buried underground, waiting. The morning they began excavating beneath the founder's monument, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. News crews lined the streets. Historians stood behind temporary barriers. Residents gathered in silence beneath gray winter skies. And at the center of it all stood Faith Sullivan. Just 6 months earlier, she had arrived in Blackridge with a backpack and nowhere to sleep. Now, hundreds of people were waiting to see what she had helped uncover. It felt impossible. Yet, somehow, it was real. The monument towered above them. For over a century, it had stood as a symbol of pride, a tribute to the families credited with building Blackridge. Children learned their names in school. Their faces appeared in textbooks. Their stories were celebrated every year during town festivals. But now, for the first time, people were beginning to ask a different question. What if the story they had been told wasn't the whole story? The excavation began shortly after sunrise. Hours passed. Workers dug through layers of stone and earth. Nothing. Then, shortly after noon, someone shouted, a hollow chamber had been discovered. Directly beneath the monument, Faith's heart nearly stopped. The crowd pressed forward. Reporters raised cameras. The workers carefully removed a rusted steel hatch hidden beneath decades of concrete. Below it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the historians entered. Faith followed close behind. The air underground was cold and still. Dust coated every surface. Flashlights swept across stone walls. And then they found it. A room. Small. Hidden. Forgotten. Waiting. Wooden crates lined the walls. Shelves overflowed with documents. Boxes contained property deeds, personal letters, financial records, court transcripts, and maps. Thousands of pages. A century of evidence. The missing pieces Clara Whitmore had risked her life to protect. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Some simply stared. Others cried. Because suddenly, the truth was no longer a theory. It was undeniable. The room contained proof of everything. The forged signatures, the illegal land transfers, the intimidation campaigns, the names of families who had been erased from history. And among those records was one final discovery. A sealed ledger wrapped in cloth. On the cover was a handwritten note. Faith recognized the handwriting immediately. Clara. With trembling hands, she opened it. The final pages revealed something nobody expected. Clara had not been writing only for historians. She had been writing for the future. The last entry read, "If you are reading this, then the truth survived." Faith felt tears sting her eyes. The room had become completely silent. Everyone was listening. She continued reading. "I know there may come a time when my name is forgotten. That does not matter. What matters is that the people who were silenced are remembered. What matters is that someone, somewhere, chooses courage over comfort. If that person is you, then know this." Faith's voice faltered. She swallowed hard and read the final sentence aloud. "You were never meant to carry this burden alone." No one moved. Several people openly wept. Because somehow, across an entire century, Clara's words felt personal, as though she were speaking directly to every person standing there, especially Faith. The story exploded across the country. The recovered records led to official investigations. Historical markers were rewritten. Families finally received recognition for losses that had been ignored for generations. The founder's monument itself was eventually removed. In its place stood something entirely different. A memorial wall, not dedicated to power, not dedicated to wealth, but to the families whose names history had tried to erase. Hundreds attended the unveiling ceremony. Many traveled across the country. Some came carrying photographs. Others brought stories passed down through generations. Stories they had once feared nobody would believe. Now they were finally being heard. Months later, the library reopened. Not as a tourist attraction, not as a museum, but as a place of remembrance. A place where forgotten voices could never be buried again. The restoration wasn't perfect. Some scars remained. The fire had left its mark. Time had left its mark. But perhaps that made the building more beautiful. Because healing isn't about erasing damage. It's about moving forward despite it. Faith understood that now, more than anyone. On the morning of the reopening, she arrived before sunrise. The building was quiet, the same way it had been the night she first stepped through its doors seeking shelter from a snowstorm. She walked slowly through the halls, past the reading room, past the archives, past the shelves that had changed her life. Everything felt familiar, and yet completely different. Near the entrance stood a small plaque. Simple, unassuming. It wasn't dedicated to politicians, or founders, or wealthy families. Instead, it carried a single inscription. For those whose voices refused to disappear. Faith stood there for a long time, thinking about Clara, thinking about the families, thinking about the frightened young woman she used to be, the girl who believed she belonged nowhere, the girl who spent her entire childhood waiting for someone to choose her. And then something unexpected happened. A small voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Faith turned. A little girl stood nearby, holding her mother's hand. She couldn't have been older than 10. The child smiled shyly. "Are you Faith?" Faith nodded. The girl reached into her pocket and handed over a folded piece of paper. "I wanted you to have this." Then she ran back to her mother. Curious, Faith unfolded it. Inside was a simple drawing. The library, the monument, the town, and in the center, a handwritten message. "Thank you for not giving up." Faith stared at the words. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Then tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, not tears of relief, something deeper. Because suddenly she understood. The library had never saved her. The truth had never saved her. The people had the connections, the purpose, the courage to keep going when walking away would have been easier. For 21 years, she had searched for a family. What she found instead was a community, a place where she mattered, a place where she belonged, and perhaps that was even better. As the doors opened and visitors began filling the library, Faith stepped aside and watched them enter. Children, teachers, families, students, strangers, each carrying their own stories, their own memories, their own hopes. The building no longer felt abandoned. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt alive. And as sunlight poured through the restored windows, Faith smiled, because she finally understood something that had taken her entire life to learn. Home is not where you start. Home is where your story finds meaning. And standing inside the library that had once sheltered a homeless orphan from a winter storm, Faith Sullivan knew with absolute certainty she had finally come home. Faith Sullivan entered the abandoned library with nothing but a backpack and nowhere to go. She thought she was searching for shelter. Instead, she found purpose. The century-old secret she uncovered changed a town. But the greatest discovery wasn't hidden beneath the library. It was hidden inside herself. Because sometimes the people who feel forgotten are the very ones destined to make a difference. Sometimes losing everything is what leads us to where we truly belong. As Faith watched the library come back to life, she finally understood. Home isn't where you come from. It's where your story finds meaning. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because the next forgotten story may change your life, too.